Heavenly versus earthly good. The Lord is my rock, my fortress and my deliverer, my God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. The words used to describe the Lord are related, and there's no doubt of their intent. When he wrote this, King David was still being hunted by Saul. It's certainly not an accident that he uses these phrases. It's clear that despite overwhelming odds of him remaining alive, David had unwavering confidence in the Lord to protect and deliver him. Was David naive? Of course not. He realized, as we should, that even if Saul were to catch up with him and take his life, David's soul would still be perfectly safe. All too often we forget that, this world is not our home and, we're only passing through. When I was a new Christian, I recall hearing the phrase, "Don't be so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good." I'm afraid the pendulum has swung to the opposite, that, we're so earthly minded that we're no heavenly good, to the extent that we don't consider eternal things often enough. How would it change your life if, for the next 30 days, you thought about heaven for 5 minutes out of your day? Take the challenge with me and report your findings. Becoming desperate for God. The cords of death entangled me, the torrents of destruction overwhelmed me. The cords of the grave coiled around me, the snares of death confronted me. In my distress I called to the Lord, I cried to my God for help. From his temple he heard my voice, my cry came before him, into his ears. For most of us, we're not desperate for God as David was. He could probably feel Saul breathing down his neck. He cried to God like there was no tomorrow, and it was very real in his life. So the question I ask is, what will it take for us not only to need God but to be desperate for him? I write that not at all knowing personal situations of most readers, so forgive me if I misspeak about your needs and desperation. Everything about us hinges on that question, what will it take, or what am I willing to do, to be desperate for God? Our life, ministry, and relationships are all affected by the answer to that question. Even if the answer is, I'm not willing to do a thing to become desperate for God, it still will affect your life and ministry. I would also like to remind you of a post I made 2 days ago. It's day 3. The Lord is my rock, my fortress and my deliverer, my God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. The words used to describe the Lord are related, and there's no doubt of their intent. When he wrote this, King David was still being hunted by Saul. It's certainly not an accident that he uses these phrases. It's clear that despite overwhelming odds of him remaining alive, David has unwavering confidence in the Lord to protect and deliver him. Was David naive? Of course not. He realized, as we should, that even if Saul were to catch up with him and take his life, David's soul would still be perfectly safe. All too often we forget that, this world is not our home and, we're only passing through. When I was a new Christian, I recall hearing the phrase, "Don't be so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good." I'm afraid the pendulum has swung to the opposite, that, we're so earthly minded that we're no heavenly good, to the extent that we don't consider eternal things often enough. How would it change your life if, for the next 30 days, you thought about heaven for 5 minutes out of your day? A delight. The earth trembled and quaked, and the foundations of the mountains shook. They trembled because he was angry. Smoke rose from his nostrils, consuming fire came from his mouth, burning coals blazed out of it. He parted the heavens and came down, dark clouds were under his feet. He mounted the cherubim and flew, he soared on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, the dark rain clouds of the sky. Out of the brightness of his presence clouds advanced, with hailstones and bolts of lightning. The Lord thundered from heaven, the voice of the Most High resounded. He shot his arrows and scattered the enemy, with great bolts of lightning he routed them. The valleys of the sea were exposed and the foundations of the earth laid bare at your rebuke, Lord, at the blast of breath from your nostrils. He reached down from on high and took hold of me, he drew me out of deep waters. He rescued me from my powerful enemy, from my foes, who were too strong for me. They confronted me in the day of my disaster, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out into a spacious place, he rescued me because he delighted in me. The imagery David describes is vivid and emphasizes a great point. David called to him, and God moved heaven and earth to rescue him. Why? It's the question King David probably asked too. It's summed up in verse 19, because he delighted in me. Can you imagine that revelation when David figured it out? When it hits us, we too should be overwhelmed with the thought, he delights in me. Thankfully, the Lord has dealt with me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands he has rewarded me. If our righteousness depended on what we did, we'd be in a very sorry state. It's one of the largest excuses people will tell you how they think they'll get to heaven. It goes something like this: all my good will be weighed against my bad, and I think my good will outweigh the bad. When questioned further, they could not tell you how much good that is, nor can they tell you how much bad that it is. In other words, there are no standards. With Christ though, none of us meet the standard on our own. There is none righteous, no, not one. So, while it seems like David is weighing the bad and the good, he would have known Isaiah 64 verse 6, all of us have become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous acts are like filthy rags. David realizes his righteousness is not of his own doing, but that of Christ's. It's certainly not from anything David or we did. Thankfully. After God's own heart. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, I am not guilty of turning from my God. All his laws are before me, I have not turned away from his decrees. I have been blameless before him and have kept myself from sin. The Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands in his sight. King David repeats what he said previously. Both Samuel 13:14 and Acts 13 verse 22 state the same thing, that David was a man after God's own heart. But now thy kingdom shall not continue, the Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. And when he had removed him, he raised up unto them David to be their king, to whom also he gave testimony, and said, I have found David the son of Jesse, a man after mine own heart, which shall fulfill all my will. And yet we know that David was a big sinner. How does that jibe? Yes, David was a sinner, and he and his family paid dearly for his sins. But he also able to realize the error of his ways when confronted. When people pointed out his sins, he could have easily had them executed on the spot, but despite his great faults, even he realized that he could not run away from his sin and failures. As David would later say in Psalm 51, my sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart you, God, will not despise. And God did indeed desire David to have that broken spirit, the spirit he desires us all to have if we are to grow. The inextinguishable light. To the faithful you show yourself faithful, to the blameless you show yourself blameless, to the pure you show yourself pure, but to the devious you show yourself shrewd. You save the humble but bring low those whose eyes are haughty. You, Lord, keep my lamp burning, my God turns my darkness into light. With your help I can advance against a troop, with my God I can scale a wall. For centuries God has turned darkness into light. In the Old Testament, he shone that light into the darkness to see what was actually there. People ran from it and did what they could to cover over it. In the New Testament, Jesus came as that light. People ran from him, tried to murder him, and did everything they could to extinguish the light. It's no accident that David uses that metaphor here. He knew deep darkness, and he knew great light. We, like David, face both at various times in our lives. We tend to forget the light times when we're in the midst of darkness, and often the light times make us forget the dark times. But the fact that we continue to return to the light means that God is still working in our lives. The inextinguishable light of Jesus is much like a pilot light in a stove, always burning, always ready to provide more light and radiance, and I fully realize that this metaphor falls short. He will not force that brightness on us but instead waits for us to call on him.